Okay, a really warm welcome to everyone this evening who's joining us from near and from far. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to the first talk of the fall 2023 cycle of online dialogues at Mind and Life Europe. This is part of our Mind Matters series, in which we've decided to take up the notion of Gaia for this particular year under the umbrella of our larger theme this year at Mind and Life Europe, which is caring for life. And so many of you who've already followed the previous talks, we have Bruce Clark in the audience, who actually gave a wonderful first talk in February with Sébastien Dutreuil. And then we followed that talk with a really riveting talk by Dave Abram in June. Both of those talks are available on our YouTube channel. And now this evening, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Tyler Volk, whom I'll tell you a little bit about in just a second. And so with the Gaia series at Mind and Life Europe, we're really interested in taking a more complex and nuanced and one could say an active approach to the subject, both to better understand and also sense into our entanglement with all of life on this planet. So I think you'll find that Tyler's talk this evening is a really phenomenal example of complex systems thinking and a really flexible, supple way of looking at the future of life on this planet. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tyler. So Dr. Tyler Volk is Emeritus Professor of Biology and Environmental Studies at New York University. He's been a major player in the development of Gaia theory, with invitations from James Lovelock to present at all three of the famous Oxford Gaia conferences in the 1990s, and he organized the opening session on core ideas at the Second Chapman Conference on the Gaia hypothesis in Valencia, Spain in 2000. And over the decades, via books and papers, he's developed a distinctive version of Gaia, or what he calls the biosphere. Recently, he was invited by a prior Emily speaker, whom we have here, Bruce Clark, to contribute an essay to his 2022 book, Writing Gaia, The Scientific Correspondence of James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis. His own books include, many books actually, include Quarks to Culture, How We Came to Be, CO2 Rising, The World's Greatest Environmental Challenge, What is Death? A Scientist Looks at the Cycle of Life, Gaia's Body, Toward a Physiology of Earth, and Metapatterns Across Space, Time, and Mind. And if you're interested in reading specifically more of his papers on Gaia, his scientific papers on Gaia, there's a link at his website, which we can drop into the chat later this evening. So we will have the first part of the evening devoted to the talk and presentation, and then we'll open up the floor in the second part of the evening to an open dialogue and questions. So if you have questions, save them. You can start writing them in the chat as they come to mind, or you can just raise your hand in the second part of the evening, and we'll have you come into dialogue with Tyler. So Tyler, thank you so much once again for joining us this evening, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Johanna, and everybody in the Mind Life group. Really a pleasure to be here. I haven't spoken on Gaia for a few years now, so it gave me a chance to put some new ideas together for you all. There was some interest in my work on metapatterns as well as Gaia, and I was asked whether I could combine the two in some sort of way, and so I'm going to do that by using metapatterns to walk through some major ideas about Gaia. I hope to keep this to about 30-35 minutes. We'll see. I have lots of time for discussion, so please remember or jot down your ideas or things you'd like to talk about when we finish. So I think I'll start right with the slides now and talk to them. And hopefully this will be the right one to click on. Oops, let's see. Is that the title slide?
Yes, great.
Okay, so I titled this How Gaia Works, to give you an in-depth, but not too much in-depth, but a little sense of what's there in the workings of Gaia, or what I often call biosphere. Now, what is this thing called Gaia? We're going to be getting into that during the whole talk. The biosphere itself is a very thin part of the Earth. We are not talking about the whole Earth. We are talking about the biosphere, or I will also use the word synonymously, Gaia. And I'm going to go into why is this a thing? Why is this a system? Why can we talk about it as a real physical, biophysical entity, not merely a projection of human language? I've been working on these issues for a long time. I was predisposed to be interested in Gaia from my PhD dissertation in 1984, which had to do with putting life into the mathematical models of the global carbon cycle. And I also worked with phosphorus and nitrogen and salinity. And this was part of the overall aim to understand the global carbon cycle better and to be better able to predict the fate of atmospheric CO2 as humans are putting fossil fuel CO2 into the atmosphere. Therefore, I was naturally led to the Gaia ideas, in which there is some deep integration of organisms with their surrounding environments, so much that they might even, in the early versions of Lovelock's writings, control and regulate the global systems of the biosphere. So I looked back. This gave me the opportunity to look back on the first time I participated in something with the word Gaia, or used the word Gaia myself in a talk, and that was the 1988, down at the bottom, Chapman Conference on the Gaia hypothesis, in which I was involved with atmospheric CO2 weathering and the terrestrial biosphere. And then at the top, my most recent publication, it's already been mentioned. I put in press, apologize, Bruce. It's published 2022, Cambridge University Press. And I wrote a commentary in that book called Tangled Up in Gaia. And because in a way now that's been more than 30 years in which my professional life has been literally tangled up in Gaia in various ways. I spoke in 2019 at the James Lovelock Centenary in Exeter on a panel, and I'm particularly proud of organizing a first opening session of the second Chapman on the Gaia hypothesis, to invite people to really deal with the core ideas of Gaia. And there's been many papers, both before and after, particularly in the 2000s and in the 1990s, either that have the word Gaia in them in my papers or are relevant to Gaia, because I was looking at the impacts of life on the various Earth systems. So that's my most wordy slide, I promise. Some of this work was summarized, well, not summarized really, but temporarily summarized as a way station in my book Gaia's Body Toward a Physiology of Earth. And you see, I'm comfortable with using the word physiology there and talking about Gaia having a body. And I also said I would use some of my work from Metapatterns across space, time, and mind, in which I was looking at principles that cut across scales that can be used for systems thinking about various kinds of systems, non-living, living, social, and even mental systems. And since I'm going to use Metapatterns as a rough pathway to my talk today, let me show you these main Metapatterns that I developed in the book Metapatterns Across Space, Time, and Mind. And at the upper sort of 11 o'clock on that diagram to you is the word systems, drawn as a circle, and in the middle is the Zen Enso. So we want to talk about Gaia as a system. We want to talk about its relations and its internal relations, its borders, whether there are particular binaries in Gaia, holarchy versus hierarchy, the parts of Gaia. And then on the left side there, arrows, breaks, and cycles, I'm not going to talk about as specific guideposts during this seminar, but they're going to be recurrent themes because we can't really talk about Gaia without talking about the biosphere in time. Stabilization, and in particular, cycles are just going to be all over the place, as you'll see, and they are really key, in my opinion, to understanding the Gaia system. A recent metapattern I've been thinking about a lot personally and writing in my notebooks is the pattern of sameness and difference across different scales. And I wanted to bring that in a little bit today too. And so one way to bring that in that stands out to me is the issue of Gaia and organisms inside Gaia. To what degree is Gaia like an organism, and when is Gaia very different from an organism? And some of the debates over the many decades of Gaia theory have really revolved around some of this, sort of a contrast and comparison, in particular some of the works of James Lovelock that were talking about Gaia regulating its environment to be stable over time and good for life, the way an organism's metabolism may be good for it. And you'll see as we go on, I'll bring up the word later, metabolism. I'm very, very happy with the word metabolism. I'll be reluctant to say that Gaia is alive, but I've in my early sort of days of thinking about the universe, I'd often say to myself, the universe is alive. So the word life can be used on very different scales, and we can I'd love to talk about that at the end as well. So first thing is to think about Gaia as a system, and then you see there on the top about 12 o'clock a square and a squiggly line that have to do with the relations. The square has to do with surface area. So I wanted to show you something about surface areas in Gaia to start with. There's a lot of surface area inside the human body with all the cells exchanging through their membranes, but we can now talk about the surface area of within Gaia. Here's a calculation that I did. The circles represent our comparative areas. And there you see at the upper left, the Earth in space. If you were looking at the Earth from a distance in space, as you unfold Earth's surface area, it's 4 times the cross-sectional area. So that's the larger black circle is Earth area. I just called it 1. And then we can see there all the leaves of the planet, that'd be just the land plants, are equal to about equal to Earth's surface area. Surfaces of all the roots of plants are about 35 times Earth's surface area. The surfaces of ocean plankton, about 6 times Earth's surface area. All bacteria, the counts vary, but this was the rough numbers and rounded off at the time. All bacteria's surface area is about 200 times the surface area of the planet Earth itself. And the hyphae of fungi it's very popular topic these days, mushrooms and fungi in the soil, 6 times their surface area. And not to neglect some of the non-living parts, cloud droplets, 100 times Earth's surface area. So, but what you see there, since the surface areas of the living things that are inside the biosphere, inside life, are from leaves to bacteria equal to or many times, in some cases, order of magnitudes larger than Earth's surface area itself. And the surfaces of living things are really active. They're continually pumping materials in and energy and pumping materials out as waste. There's a really active effects of life is very active, and therefore we can expect the effects of life to be very large on the environments that the organisms are within. We want to talk about, if we talk about Gaia as a thing, as a system, we want to talk about the borders of Gaia and what makes it a system. Why do I say it's important to break out the biosphere or Gaia as something special to think about rather than just look at planet Earth as a whole? One way to get at this is the mixing times of the atmosphere, of soil and the ocean. This is the times it takes to mix. The atmosphere mixes completely in about 1 year. This is relevant to the CO2 issue because the CO2 levels above Antarctica are virtually the same as the CO2 levels in the Northern Hemisphere, even though the penguins in Antarctica did not do very much to increase the CO2 levels there. So this is showing that the CO2 is mixing really well. The soil mixes via life and weathering reactions in years to hundreds of years typically. Some soils can be much older than that. And the ocean, I show a wave there, and I don't mean to say the wave takes 1,000 years to break. The surface of the ocean is very active, Gulf streams, they circulate very quickly. But chemical oceanographers, through studying isotopes, have shown that the entire world's ocean, the depths of the Pacific Ocean, depths of the Atlantic Ocean, circulates in about 1,000-year time scale. So therefore, the something that happens at the surface of the ocean goes down and affects the depths of the ocean about 1,000 years. And now the 1,000 years sounds like a long time, but if we're thinking about evolution of life, these are virtually instantaneous. And furthermore, there's exchanges between all these. The atmosphere penetrates into the soil, and soil bacteria put gases out into the atmosphere. The atmosphere exchanges gases with the ocean back and forth, CO2, oxygen, all the gases, and rivers carry sediments down to the ocean. And so there is a connection between these. I call them the matrices of Gaia, because life is now going to be inside these matrices, almost virtually instantaneous on an evolutionary viewpoint standpoint. And this is very different from the rocks underneath the soil, in which the molecules or crystals within a rock can be in touch. It can have the same neighbors for millions of years or hundreds of millions of years. So some of those elements were once in the biosphere, they got put into rocks and they can stay there for a long, long time. But this system, the surface system biosphere, is very rapidly mixed. In fact, I like to say the atmosphere is, in a way, a free blood, it's like the blood. It circulates and it mixes the gases among all the organisms. But they don't have to do it through evolution. It's free. More on the system of Gaia and the borders. I put here to have a little fun with gods and goddesses, Vulcan down below Gaia, and Helios, the sun above, and then the black void of space up there that is receiving our infrared fluxes. And Gaia is in the middle there, the biosphere. The upper surface is the top of the atmosphere. It takes in the sunlight, of course, and the atmosphere gives off the infrared. That's what this is what the greenhouse effect is all about. And inside Gaia there, you see all kinds of things happening with greenhouse gases and clouds and aerosols, and there's ocean chemistry. We're going to focus on that. But down below is Vulcan, and we have the rocks, and we have the volcanoes, and there is exchange through a lower surface with the Gaia system. But I will show you later that this exchange, although it's vital to our lives, it is relatively small in magnitude. Specifically, we'll look at the fluxes of carbon that come up new from down below, from the lower surface, to Gaia, and the burial that happens. And we know that, for example, most of photosynthesis does not go into oil and coal. It gets recirculated through respirers that are putting it back into CO2 into the system. But I do want to point out that there is an upper surface and a lower surface. These are not membranes. This is something that's different from life. There's not an evolved skin in any kind of way here. These are discontinuities of material connection. So in Gaia, I showed you atmosphere, ocean, and soil are very closely connected with each other and exchanging on very short time scales. And there's much slower time scales with Vulcan. And the time scales across the upper surface are, well, there's a lot of exchange of sunlight coming in. We couldn't exist without that happening. We and the bacteria and plants could not exist without that, and the Earth could not cool itself to space. But the discontinuity there is between the atmosphere and space. So discontinuities are very important in the structure of Gaia's borders. Oops. Where am I here? Okay. Now we're going along, going around the circle here clockwise from 12 o'clock going around. And I just want to mention a couple things about binary systems. Binary systems in the metapatterns ideas and the metapatterns concepts has to do with often nature arranges itself in binaries. I think it's or dualisms. I think it's because it's the simplest way to form complexity. It's the simplest way to have a system. And that's also dealing with the human mind, is compare and contrast. Let's take two things. Let's two roads taken. On one hand, this. On the other hand, this. On one hand, Gaia is like an organism. On the other hand, Gaia is not like an organism. So we have a couple of binaries, mostly as thinking tools. One, Gaia, an organism, as I've been mentioning. The other is clearly important, as I think is starting to appear, life and inert matter. What's the relationship between living things and the inert part, the inorganic parts of the Gaian matrices, and organic and inorganic? And one particular a dualism to think about is CO2 and oxygen, the exchange that we all learn about in elementary school, the way humans and bacteria and animals give off CO2 and use oxygen, and the way plants give off oxygen. And this will come in, I want to sort of go into that and deepen it with the Gaian perspective, more than what you might have thought about in from third grade on. Okay. So, but then moving on from binaries down with the concentric circles there around 5 o'clock on the diagram, holarchies, the nestedness of Gaia. We want to really get into what are the parts of Gaia at this point. When you would get parts within parts, scales, and the word metabolism, as I told you, I am very comfortable using. There is a metabolism in the biosphere, just as there are metabolisms in all living things. So the mixing again. Now, layered within this are what I'm going to call biochemical guilds, living things that are within the soil, within the ocean, and in the case of plants, within the atmosphere, as plants put their CO2 collecting organs called leaves out into the atmosphere. The way these guilds come about, one has to realize, a very important fact to realize, is that the atoms stay the same. In this diagram, I labeled a black circle as a carbon atom, Dave, for Dave Keeling, who discovered quantified in detail the rising levels of atmospheric CO2 in the late 1950s and early 60s. And Dave, the carbon atom here, this is from my book, CO2 Rising, can go in and out of different molecules. In this case, a cellulose molecule, a bicarbonate ion, or a CO2 molecule. These atoms can go in and out of various molecular forms. This is really, I think, sort of a mind-blowing fact of our universe. The atoms are, to the most part, immortal, and they go in and out of the molecules, which themselves can get born and can die as the molecular forms undergo chemical reactions. This is leading toward the understanding of the biochemical guilds, which I am getting to. And so if we look at carbon circulating, the width of these arrows represents the magnitude of the flows of carbon in different forms. So different forms, but all flows of carbon. This is something that carbon cycle scientists are dealing with all the time. And you see these are in billions of metric tons of carbon per year. And these are in the steady state values prior to human perturbation to the system. And I'm pointing this out compared to the fossil fuels going into the atmosphere. It's currently about 10, not 9 billion tons per year. It might even more. But that's very small compared to these giant fluxes of CO2 going into plants, of plant material going into the soil, of the 60 tons of carbon in the form of CO2 going into the atmosphere from soil bacteria, of 100 billion tons a year going back and forth between the atmosphere and ocean in air-sea gas exchange. Now, why are we worried about our fossil fuel CO2? It's because we're taking it from down deep and injecting it as new carbon down deep into this system that is relatively balanced for a long, long time. What keeps it balanced? It doesn't have to be balanced for all the time, but there's negative feedbacks that if something gets imbalanced, the other fluxes increase. This is something I'm not going into, but I'd love for you to just, be in awe at it for a few seconds in the carbon cycle. And the various biochemical guilds are performing these transformations, these sort of metabolism of the biosphere that is interconnecting the things of the biosphere. Now we come to the biochemical guilds. So this was a term I coined in writing my book, Gaia's Body, although people involved with modeling, mathematical modeling of Gaia principles, in a way we're using biochemical guilds, because what you might do for a biochemical guild in modeling the system of the biosphere system, one might put together all the photosynthesizers of the ocean, for example, all the cyanobacteria and the algae, which are eukaryotes, and you might lump them together into photosynthesis. I did that. I did this many times myself. Lump together things into all photosynthesizers, or all respirers, things, organisms that are emitting CO2. And that way we are a member of the guild, respirers, along with the soil bacteria. We are in that way memberships of guilds that make us different from the photosynthesizers. So genetically, we're not more similar to the bacteria than we are to land plants. We are eukaryotes like land plants are, but in some ways we are biochemically similar to respiring bacteria in the soil. There's also methane producers in the carbon cycle. I'm not putting in everything in these cycles here. I'm just trying to show you the idea of the biochemical guilds. So methane producers are called methanogens, generators of methane. There's many kinds of archaea, prokaryotes that do that. And then nitrogen, you can go through the element nitrogen. There's nitrogen fixers, there's denitrifiers, there's nitrifiers, and they all perform similar intake and outflow, exiting chemical transformations, even though they are specifically different species. And one can do the same for sulfur. The idea being that once these waste chemicals go out into the atmosphere or soil or ocean, in a way it doesn't matter what guild it came from, these waste products are going into those various Gaian matrices and now are available to work chemistry within those matrices. And the same goes for the feeding that can happen, the nutrition, the intake that are happening to organisms. It doesn't matter if it's the CO2 going into an oak tree or a maple tree or an algae in a lake, terrestrial. It's taking CO2 in and affecting the CO2 content of the environment around it. It didn't really matter what the specific organism is. This is the idea of the biochemical guild as major parts of Gaia. And what happens here is that you can see in these pictures, ejected chemicals from some of the guilds end up being feedstocks for the other guilds. Famous one is carbon. We respire carbon, goes into plants, but this happens also for nitrogen and for sulfur, and we can do this for phosphorus and other groups of organisms. Oh, there's still more arrows to go. Any more? Oh, there's another arrow. Okay, that's a really squiggly one. Okay, now I put this all together. These are my material I was writing about in terms of where Gaia theory should go. This is a abstract diagram, of course. All these, you can think of some ecological or Gaian system. It doesn't have to be the biosphere. I can also do this for the ocean, or I can do this for the land. I can do it for phosphorus. I can do it for nitrogen. But the idea here, the photosynthesizers, represented by a green leaf, are really important because they take the chemicals, the biochemicals from the Gaian matrices, whether it's soil, atmosphere, or ocean, and convert it into a form that then can enter food chains. And I lumped together all the other transformers, biological and non-biological. And as I showed you, many of these loops link up with each other. The exit flow can be used as an entry flow, as a waste of one can be used as a nutrient for somebody else in the biosphere. And yet these boundaries are not perfect. And of course, if it's a boundary of the ocean, I showed you it's not, we don't want it to be perfect. It exchanges with the atmosphere, enormous gas exchanges between ocean and atmosphere. But we can count, if we have studies about these, we can count what are the entry and exit fluxes, the orange arrows here, into a given system itself, as in contrast to the numbers, the quantities that are going around some system of interest. And I developed this because it doesn't have to be the biosphere. As I said, it could be a lake, it could be all of land, it could be all of the ocean. You can do this for subsystems of Gaia. But I was particularly interested to get today in Gaia, and here's some of the results when you do this. When you do carbon within the biosphere, the width of the arrows, again, represents the magnitude of the flux, the green. So carbon dioxide going into global photosynthesis, both marine and terrestrial, is about 100 billion tons of carbon per year. The CO2 coming from from rocks and volcanoes, that is new material going into the biosphere, is measured at approximately 500 million tons per year. Now, if there were no recycling from the respirers within the biosphere, the plants do not necessarily, photosynthesizers would not necessarily die, but they would be limited to what the new carbon is coming in, to using it for their bodies. And that would be 500 million tons per year. That would be 1/200th of the current photosynthesis of 100 billion tons per year. The ratio between 100 and 500 billion is a factor of 200. So the recycling of carbon within this Gaia system, of this close coupling between atmosphere, ocean, and soil, and it requires all three, atmospheres, ocean, and soils, to make this happen, to make the close coupling happen, amplifies life, using photosynthesis as a proxy for life as a whole. Not bad to use it, because then it feeds other forms. the recycling amplifies life by a factor of 200 in the case of carbon. What about nitrogen? I'm going to show you a global number for nitrogen as well. Up there, I put the factor of 200. Nitrogen is even more. The calculations I did for nitrogen. So what you see there within the biosphere or border or Gaia border, there is entry and exit. So there is stuff that gets buried, that leaves. By burial, I don't mean burial with funerals or anything. This is just material that goes into sediments and becomes parts of rock. But the volcanism and weathering has been measured, and then all these guilds inside here of the nitrogen cycle, which is really a sophisticated cycle, which I'm not going to go into. The exiting areas are all waste products becoming feedstock for other guilds. And the amplification in terms of nitrogen is that there's about 1,000 times more nitrogen going into photosynthesizers than the photosynthesizers could get from the volcanism and weathering process coming from Vulcan itself. So really phenomenal. And I did this with phosphorus and calcium, and they're not all in the hundreds. Calcium is only about it's close to 1. That's because there's a lot of calcium with the rocks. And this is something I don't have time to go into, but I believe the system, the cutting edge of evolutionary innovations tends to happen in the elements that have the highest cycling ratios, because they're the most limiting, coming from rocks and volcanism and the weathering process. And they are things like phosphorus, nitrogen, and those are elements that farms tend to have to fertilize with. That was just a little aside, 1,000 times about, not whoops. So I summed up this view of Gaia with a paper I wrote in 2004 in the book Scientists Debate Gaia. Gaia is life in a waste world of byproducts. And one colleague said, Tyler, you're making Gaia sound like one giant landfill or something like this, and I don't think it takes away from our awe. In fact, it even adds to our awe. And it's in a way, it's not a landfill, because our human landfills, we don't recycle very well. Gaia is a lot better at recycling. So someday our own waste dumps are going to be an integral part of the circular economy. And we have a lot to learn, obviously, from the biosphere system. So just to quote here, if you consider atmosphere's carbon dioxide, these are calculations I did, more than 99% of the entire reservoir of atmospheric CO2 has been recently ejected by a respirer rather than a volcano. Nitrogen, more than 99% of the atmosphere's nitrogen has been discharged from the denitrifier guild rather than volcanoes. Methane and other trace gases, more than 99% has been expelled from prokaryotes rather than volcanoes. So a bit provocatively, but something to think about. The atmosphere is one giant waste dump. And well, it's not so provocative. That's what humans are treating it like now. One giant waste dump. So breathe deeply again and enjoy the oxygen that was put there as a waste product of our Gaian fellows, the photosynthesizers. I would say plants, but it's not just the plants, it's the algae and the cyanobacteria as well. Now, there are trends here. This is the arrows. So a lot on cycles, but now are there arrows? Are there long time trends in over Earth's history since the origin of life? And yes. So from this Gaian perspective and biochemical guilds, I'm not going into details. People do work on this. When did these various guilds come into existence? When did photosynthesis come into existence, or later probably than some of the methane guilds? When did some of the nitrogen guilds come into existence? But since these guilds evolve typically because they are using a waste product of prior existing guilds as a feedstock, one would expect an increased number of guilds over time. One would therefore expect an increased degree of cycling. I was calling this the cycling ratio. And since photosynthesis, the photosynthesizer guilds are so crucial because they take inorganic carbon forms and convert it into organic carbon linked to nitrogen, phosphorus, and many other elements that are essential elements of life, you would expect increased photosynthesis over time. Some of the specific biochemical results of this have to do with specifics of the reactions, which obviously I cannot go into today, but we got higher oxygen levels over time, lower CO2 levels over time than would have been had the Earth just been a non-living planet and without the Gaian metabolism. And in terms of turning all of this into what I might call, well, we know the term eco-spirituality. One of my interests is what does this mean for us as human beings? For me, I have to say this has meant a great deal working on all this over time. It has been an immense challenge and great pleasure, and gave me insights into embedding myself as a embodied micro part of the Gaia system over time, to be a guild that contemplates the guilds, let's say the human noospheric guild that contemplates the other guilds, for me personally has been really rewarding. Something that may be of general interest is the higher oxygen level. Since we probably, our brains require so much energy, it was the discovery by certain kinds of photosynthesizers to eject oxygen as a waste product that could lead to higher metabolisms, more energetic kinds of chemical reactions that was probably necessary to have it's necessary for our brains anyway. So that's a direct connection between our thinking and Gaia. And I'm going to end with one more example. We are members of the Respirer Guild, as I mentioned. With each breath, we respire, we eject a certain number of molecules of CO2. And I started wondering, knowing that the CO2 circulates throughout the atmosphere and can get taken in by plants, what do I have to do to find my CO2 in plants, in plant leaves? And when I did a little YouTube video on this, where I go through the calculation for those that are interested in the details, and I kind of got amazed by this myself. We know the CO2 would spread out. Some starts going into the ocean, but for the first year, a lot of it's staying in the atmosphere for several years and going into leaves. It turns out I can pluck a leaf. The odds are extremely high that I can pluck a leaf from anywhere on the planet, not just where I live, not just North America, but all the way down into the Southern Hemisphere. A leaf that has grown in that past year is going to have multiple carbon atoms from a single exhalation of any of us. And each and every exhalation of us from the previous year will be in every leaf of the planet. Just put this in as an ending slide, and I'm ready to say goodbye to the formal talk, and thank you for your attendance.
Wow, well, a big thank you, Tyler, for this incredibly, I would say, enlightening overview, really, of the nuts and bolts of how Gaia works and its implications also for us and for all of life. So I'm sure we have lots of questions in the room, specifically because this was quite a dense presentation. We're getting some questions in the chat, and also there's a hand raised. So I'd like just to start off with Sophia's question. She posted it in the chat a few minutes ago. Sophia, do you want to voice your question out loud? Or would you like for me to read it? If you're not able to, I can certainly read it.
Hi, thank you. I don't know if my internet is good enough, but I will try. I wanted to thank Tyler for the presentation. I'm really honored to be here to listen. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. And I'm wondering, because I'm a biologist and this way of thinking makes me passionate about life and the study of life. And it deconstructs a lot of ways that have been put into the study of biology until now. I think it's groundbreaking, and it's it makes me passionate about that. And I love the work of Francisco Arela. I'm from Chile, so he's one of the masters that I feel in my life. And I wanted to ask you, Tyler, about the way that you feel the Gaia theory links with autopoiesis. I don't know if the way is correctly how I'm pronouncing it, but it's autopoiesis in Spanish. So yes, I wanted to hear your reflections. Thank you.
Well, great question, because I'm very familiar with the concept, and I actually did a semester with Dr. Varela when I was hanging out at the Lindisfarne Association in the late 70s and early 80s. I think, well, in terms of autopoiesis being self-generating, self-organizing, I've talked with Bruce Clark about this too, whether any system that contains an autopoietic system. I think Varela was very much thinking about organisms at the time, cells and multicellular organisms, but a system that contains the autopoietic systems as they're originally defined is probably going to be autopoietic itself, because if there are the linkages between the waste products and the feedstocks, that's very like a metabolism. And I said I'm very comfortable with using the word metabolism. So I'm very much in favor of using that term, Sophia. If you'd like to bring up more, I'm happy to hear you say something more about it.
Thank you. Yes, I've been thinking about Gaia being an autopoietic system, like just reflecting about it. I haven't done any studies, but it's like one of the feelings that I have, that it might get into it, but it's hard about the metabolism of Gaia. But I like the way that you explain it and the physiology of Gaia. I really like that. So in that way, I think autopoiesis might fit in Gaia.
I'd love to have you think more about this. Thanks for your question. One point to elaborate on, just in a few sentences, the organisms in Gaia are subject to life and death as a break. I didn't bring up the metapattern of breaks or transformations, but that's a very dramatic break, birth and death, and that makes them participants in direct tuning by evolution to have adaptations inside them. And so within our bodies, the cells with our bodies are putting out substances that other cells or other tissues use, but that is somewhat different from the metabolism of Gaia. Within our bodies, substances can be put out by tissues or cells that cost those cells energy to make. They're not waste products. Now, there are waste products that go off into our blood and go into our lungs and we breathe out as CO2. But the Gaian system is built from these waste byproducts. Now, you can have closer symbioses that, a flower that is feeding a honeybee nectar, so the honeybees going to transfer pollen, these closer symbioses, but the large-scale Gaian effects of waste being put out into the general atmosphere or general soil or general ocean are these are byproducts of the metabolism. So there are some really interesting differences between the autopoiesis of Gaia and the autopoiesis of the individual organisms, which I think is really worth thinking about further under the umbrella term of autopoiesis. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sophia, for the question. And Bruno's just posted in the chat reference to a chapter specifically on autopoiesis in his book Gaian System. So if anyone wants to reference that, it's in the chat. Alejandro, can I move to you?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much. Sorry, put on my mic. Thank you very much, Tyler, for your talk and for your work. And there's a question that intrigues me that you have put forward. If I've understood you correctly, you say that Gaia is the biosphere, but at the same time, you take an enlarged concept of the biosphere than what has traditionally been understood by biosphere, which would be what traditionally biology has studied, the organisms, the cells, and so on. Because if I understand you well, you have included the atmosphere and the oceans within this concept of the biosphere. So in the same way that Lovelock and Margulis, you have expanded the concept of biosphere, I think they abandon this concept because they prefer to speak of Gaia as a whole. But what I see that you have also done through your talk is to carefully show that the lithosphere would not be part of that Gaia system, of that biosphere. And you have defended this on the grounds that the processes are much slower and you don't have the same rate of recycling than within the biosphere. However, it seems to me that there are many features of the lithosphere that are special and that are essential to life on Earth and to its characteristics. The plate tectonics and the way in which they recycle materials over the long term are also very important for the evolution in long term and the mixing together and separation of species and so on. Also the inorganic carbon cycle as a long-term thermostat for the Earth, and even the magnetic field of the Earth. It seems it's essential in order to protect the Earth from the solar radiation and so on. And at the same time, all these features, as far as I know, are also unique to the Earth. We don't know of other planets that have plate tectonics and magnetic fields and so on. So I know that I think that we don't yet understand how plate tectonics exactly started or why, and what is it that made that in the Earth has a magnetic field and other planets don't. But it could be that it has to do with the dynamism that life has introduced in the Earth crust, that in some way originated also this process, special process of mantle convection and whatever is going on in the lithosphere, which is essential to life and maybe caused by life or maybe not. So I would like to know more about what is your take on this volcanoes system, because for me it seems difficult to consider it as something purely external to the Gaian system. It seems to be intimately linked and also dependent on the Gaia system. So I would like to hear more on this.
Okay, Alejandro, thank you. So I agree with everything you say, and the questions that you asked are very important and would require a lot of detail to go into, which I cannot, and I'm not up to speed with everything happening with plate tectonics, but I do want to respond to a couple things specifically. The term biosphere, I was concerned about that. Environmental scientists tend to use the word biosphere to meaning that which contains life and life. You are correct. A lot of ecologists use the word biosphere to mean the sum of all organisms which now they're disconnected from each other. It's just the sum of all organisms. The word does get used in two ways out there, and I did choose the one that the environmental scientists tend to be using, which is the zone that contains life, living things. Some people you were using the term ecosphere to meaning the sphere of all the ecosystems. It's good for everybody in attendance to be aware that the term does get used in different ways, and there's no one correct way. Obviously, the biosphere and all the creatures depend upon, as you brought up, the magnetic field, the volcanoes. Without the volcanoes, one reason Mars might be dead is because Mars might not have been large enough to have plate tectonics to have that exchange coming up from Vulcan to a Martian Gaia. So yes, the exchange with the plate tectonics is very important. The one now answering, should it be thought of as part of the Gaia system? I just stand by the argument that those exchanges are taking place over millions or hundreds of millions of years. It's not that they're not important. And the question of, did life affect plate tectonics? There's been this is still an ongoing question. How does life affect the presence of water on the planet, and does water lubricate the plate tectonic system? Colleague David Schwartzman, it's not clear. It's not looking like it's mainstream science right now, but it's still up for grabs. There's been recent papers on plate tectonics. The one work I did do, which is still getting cited, was the evolution of the calcium shell forming plankton in the ocean, which did not go back to the origin of life. That was more recent, and that would have transferred calcium carbonate from just being buried in shallow water to getting buried in deeper water and going down subduction zones and being more susceptible to being recycled back to CO2. So I did do a calculation that the evolution of the calcium forming plankton would have increased the atmospheric CO2 level by transferring carbonate to the deep ocean sediments, where it can go down into plate tectonic subduction zones and be recycled back to CO2 more effectively than it can be on the reefs. So what this showed me is that life can, on a long time scale, can impact the CO2 levels due to evolutionary innovations. I said, in general, the innovation is biotic enhancement of weathering, not a subject of this talk, but life grabbing minerals from soil, grabbing elements from soil minerals. But this is a very interesting ongoing topic of how evolutionary changes can affect. In the example I gave, I definitely say it can affect the recyclability of carbon by plate tectonics, and it does require these long-term million-year cycles to bring these impacts into being. A big topic.
If I just may come back. The thing is, for me, part of the interest of Gaia theory is also bringing in this million-year scale, which is very relevant nowadays for our condition. So you have insisted a lot on the quickness of how quickly the carbon moves through the atmosphere, and we can find it everywhere in the planet very quickly and so on. But processes such as the cooling of the Earth through the Cenozoic, which is now being rolled back in our time, and there are many processes that take millions of years, and you need this kind of geological view to understand it. So completely exclude this time scale from Gaia functionings, I think it takes a bit of the power of the theory.
Yeah, I fully agree. I still think that the close connection between atmosphere, soil, and ocean is, for example, that's one of the reasons we're so concerned about the CO2 going into the atmosphere now, because it acidifies the ocean, and it's not it's not going to go away and for these long time scales. The lifetime of a carbon atom, as when it comes up from a volcano and starts entering the cycling systems of the biosphere, of the biochemical guilds, is about 100,000 years. It's going to be in the biosphere for about 100,000 years before the burial processes of weathering remove it. And if it wasn't so long, we wouldn't be so worried about the fossil fuel CO2. But I do want to hand it to you, Alejandro, for bringing in these long time scales, because I remember once when I was first doing my carbon cycle work, and I was in a meeting, and many people were concerned with the ocean atmosphere and life on these faster timescales. And there were some people there, Bob Berner, doing these 100 million year timescales. And I just thought, wow, that's so abstract. I can't get concerned about that right now. I'm concerned about the current world. And yet I slowly found myself really interested in these multi-million year timescales. How does life impact long-term trends in the biochemistry of the surface? So I'm all with you in terms of this is a fascinating topic.
Thanks a lot, Alejandro, for the question. And I see Bruno also gave you a second a comment in the chat too, if you'd like to read it. So. I know Marlon has a few questions. I've seen 3 different questions come in, each with its own complexities. So Marlon, would you want to open your mic and start us out with at least your first question, and we'll see how far we get.
Thank you. Thank you, and for bringing all this. And this is kind of a very exciting. Also, because I come from probably through the side of Metapatterns. I don't know, Tyler, we met in the 90s near NYU. I don't know if you remember me, I'm the dancer. And so one of the things that I feel that is really interesting for me now is asking if the metapattern as some kind of epistemic tool or some kind of composing mind and time and space at the same time. Is it now that the computation has advanced in power, is there some, let's say, are there more than epistemic frame, or are they related now with a lot of the mathematics that can be used to understand probably and sometimes have better numbers in relationship to what is going on? Because at the end, I was always seeing the metapatterns as this dynamic composition that was happening at the same time and everywhere. So then, so it's beautiful to see, okay, there is this Gaia and how all this is happening. And it's not only an epistemic fantasy or some kind of a hermeneutic tool to understand. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so I did with Jeff Bloom, I did write a paper explaining metapatterns. I guess this is the 2000 something 9 maybe. You can find it on my website. But in there I did address this question you're raising of what's the relationship between these sort of imagistic metapatterns and mathematics, the mathematics of complexity theory that's going on, or nonlinear dynamical systems that are mathematized, and work of the complexity people, or Barabasi, or lots of other people with what do you want to call it, power law. So they're not advanced to be that. And all I can say is that a couple things. One is that the mathematical patterns, and mathematical metapatterns, you might say, are both have an advantage and disadvantage. One is that the advantage that these people can do mathematics, let's say on protein networks in a cell, and show it to somebody else, and they can do the same math. The disadvantage is they're limited to what they can mathematize at the time. So if one wants to start looking at, let's say, metapatterns in creation myths of different cultures around the world, which I once had a undergraduate class take on as a project, there's a lot you can do. You can get into immediately with metapatterns and dualities and creation myths, or breaks in creation myths, and start comparing them and contrasting them without having to mathematize them. So that's the advantage of the metapatterns. The disadvantage is that because it's not mathematized, it's harder to it's more of humanities or some of the social sciences arguments, where one is looking at things from pictures and verbal descriptions and showing people, yeah, there really is something here to think about. Now, you say it's epistemic, and I just want to make a couple remarks about that. Today, I used it epistemically as a tool to walk me through certain questions about the Gaia system. And when I was originally doing the work with Gaia theory, I was using metapatterns unconsciously. I was not myself walking through it systematically, although I was saying, well, if people are talking about Gaia, what is the system? What are its borders? I was conscious about that, but I just used it unconsciously, almost automatically, to help me think. But I want to say, with regard to the epistemic view of part of metapatterns, I think the metapatterns really are out there. In not that the systems have to manifest these metapatterns, but then one can make reasoning for functionality of the metapatterns to understand why would systems that can create evolutionary adaptations, and here I would include all biology and cultural systems. There are reasons that the metapatterns are not just epistemological, but ontological. That's what I would say. Any follow-up to that?
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I think that what I just have to say is, like, for me, has always been very clear that it's not only an ontology, it's not only epistemical, it's more the ontological. And I actually put here, it's almost like a ontological choreography, or, it's like, in a way, it's easier to see movement that, from the background in arts. So then there was this really interesting thing. It's like, okay, how to put all this together.
Yeah, I like a what was your word there? I like that word.
I put ontological or epistemic choreography.
Choreography.
Yeah, that is kind of more about the dynamics, and there are patterns in it, and at the same there are phase spaces, that there are improvisational patterns, but it's actually the change that is the systemic changes that are for the emergent properties. So using the theory to explain that. Yeah.
Nice. Very nice. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Marlon. And I think, Bruno, you also had a follow-up comment on this, which is really nice. Do you want to just say it out loud, or would you like me to read it? Okay. He says, I think of Tyler's metapatterns as a highly refined body of diagrammatics. As he says, tools for thinking, ontologically, yes, but this level of content has to be filled into the diagram. So it's a nice.
I was searching for my cursor.
Oh, okay. There you are. No problem.
I just offered that as, I think the metapatterns, it was a beautiful way to organize the lecture. Just at that level, and to systematize your exposition. And I love a good diagram. And so to me, the metapatterns is like a super presentation of what you can do with the diagram and how you can use that as a tool for thinking. So I was impressed, Tyler, by how you synthesized your life project in what you gave us today.
Thanks, Bruno. Let's see. I know, Laura, why don't we turn to you now? I know you had a question about eco-spirituality you wanted to bring up.
Yes, thank you very much. Hi, Tyler. Nice to meet you. So, yes, I would like to hear a bit more about what you said, kind of the end of your talk about the eco-spirituality and this practice of contemplation, because, I was thinking of myself from a first-person perspective as a breathing being. So I'm a living being who is breathing, right? And in a way, from within the biosphere, I'm taking part to the Gaia's metabolism, right? And well, a colleague and friend of mine would call this maybe sharing life, right? In this process of maybe when I sit in front of a tree and I am with the tree and I'm breathing in a way with the tree, right? And I don't know if you think that, well, I say that I am a breathing being, but I can also consciously breathe. And we know that in different traditions, we have these breathing exercises. And so I wanted to ask you if you have something to say about these breathing exercises as a contemplative practices, precisely from your perspective. So taking into consideration Gaia's body, right? So really starting from this physiological dimension of taking part to Gaia's metabolism, maybe. I don't know. Any ideas about this?
Yeah, great lead in. Did you happen to see David Abrams' talk last?
Unfortunately not, but I know about this talk from friends who told me about what he said. Yes.
He did a lot of great discussion and ideas about breathing. He'd be worth looking at his the video of his talk. That was really magnificent. I mean, he's about the CO2 oxygen exchange. I guess for me, I mean, I'd love to hear more from you, but I probably said the main point that would make me think about, and I do practice meditation of various kinds. The biochemical guild that we're not just with, say, other animals in breathing, but we're also with the bacteria, the respiring bacteria, not the photosynthetic bacteria. Although all photosynthesizers, it turns out plants respire too. At night, they're putting CO2 into the atmosphere, not as much as they took into themselves during the day, because they have to have net growth as they're putting the carbon atoms in. So that's really reiterating what I said earlier. But your question does allow me to bring up something I did not mention. There is the term eco-spirituality, but in terms of using Gaia science to inform one's eco-spirituality, I was thinking of a term. I don't know what you think about it. I'd love your immediate response to this. I'm putting you on the spot here. I haven't said the term yet. Not biospirituality, but biospirituality. Biospirituality. What do you think of that? Is that too corny?
No, it is extremely interesting. I needed to digest it a bit, but since you asked me my direct response, I will say that if we take biospirituality and we take this biosphere as this, place that we are in as organism, right? And I am one of these organism, right? So I don't want to have a spectacular view of the biosphere. This is what an action told us to do, right? Not to be spectators, but engage with. And we are from within there. So how could we be the agent of this biospirituality as one of the many breathing spiritual beings that from within express the spirituality of the biosphere? I don't know, but I'm just talking aloud. But this word made me think. Thank you. Yes, it is interesting.
Well,
but have you written about this, or is just something that just pop up now? This biospirituality.
Well, the book Metapatterns, I did in the chapter on spheres in nature and the sphere used in cultural history, such as in very important religious symbolisms of halos and spheres. I went through various mythic uses of the sphere. I did have a section of that chapter called spirituality, because I thought that the sphere is really interesting to contemplate, and also one's mind. I was suggesting that culture and society tends to make us sort of more linear beings, where we start off as children as being spheres, cognitively spheres. We're interested in many, many things. And so I did coin the term spirituality at the time, but it was just thinking of this talk a couple days ago that I had the term biospirituality. And you brought up something I'm going to turn to Bruno about, but Bruno, can you put in the chat the way you think that term would be spelled, biospirituality, how you think it would be spelled, since you're an English fellow expert on. And I also want to bring up Bruno's idea. I didn't go into the metapattern of centered versus distributed, but I think that comes into the biospirituality that we're involved with today as a global people, because do we think of ourselves as centers of the biosphere, that we're in control now? We're going to control, and to some extent we have to control atmospheric CO2 levels. So we become this center where the biosphere, I see it as a distributed system. There's no one species or one guild really in control. The photosynthesizers have a particular kind of importance, but as I showed you, without the respirers, they're 0.5% of what they would currently be at maximum. And so it needs all the cooperation of the guilds operating as a distributed system, not a centered system. And I know Bruno Clark's been thinking a lot about, do we think about embedding ourselves in the biosphere versus controlling the biosphere? And Laura, you were alluding to some of these issues in what you said. Thank you.
If I just only say these things in reference to the sphere, and since you were also saying something about, the center, the periphery, the center, all these things, there is a quote by Giordano Bruno, an Italian philosopher who I love him very much. I think that is great. And he speaks about this infinite sphere where each point is the center and the periphery. Each point. And I think that this is a great image in thinking about a sphere, because very often we just think about the center, but it is infinite exactly because each point is the center and the periphery.
Yes, you mean on the each point within it, or on the surface? It has there's infinite facets. There's infinite. To the surface. I mean, there was also that quote about the sphere. God is a sphere whose center is everywhere. Somebody must know that, Sacro Bosco. But great to look back upon what these thinkers were saying about the sphere. It could help us expand our own minds.
Yeah.
Over something again.
Thanks so much, Laura, for these great questions. I think Blaise Pascal also had quite a bit to say about that, 17th century. Another early prophetic thinker. So we have a couple of really, really great questions from Amy. So I'd love to invite Amy to open her mic if you're okay with that, Amy. And I think these would actually be great questions to end with, as a matter of fact.
Well, I was going back to what I think Sophia was talking about, and I know Bruno's written a lot about this as well, as the biosphere as being an autopoietic system. And I've been working on some of Francisco's texts. We're re-editing Principles of Biological Autonomy now, so it'll come out hopefully at the very beginning of next year. It was a very early text of a collection of Francisco Varela's. And so I've been rereading his discussions, early 78, 79 discussions about the time that you were around him, Tyler, on the difference between autonomous and allonymous systems, or command control systems. And I'm wondering, sort of following on to what Laura was saying, is that if we're part of these systems, how arrogant it feels to think that we can do things like block the sun. I mean, there are all sorts of wild command control, anonymous type interventions that seem to come up in the newspaper all the time, and on how we can control things. So you just said, well, we have to control things, but how do you see interventions on our part as being able to control such a system? It's maybe kind of a naive question, but
yeah, great question, Amy. And before I make a few remarks that your comment triggered, I just want to say hello to Dorian Sagan, who's here. Dorian was also at many of the key Oxford conferences on Gaia and has written extensively on Gaia. And Dorian and I, in fact, co-wrote a book, 2 separate parts, called Death and Sex. So hello, Dorian. And you put something in the chat. So Amy, the term anonymous, I hadn't heard that term before. I guess allo be other would be the root of that. So auto be self organizing versus other organizing, command and control. And this is coming up now as a theme in the last 10, 15 minutes or so. I think it's a really important one. I'll be interested to see what Francisco is saying about it as you edit some of that work. But your thought about it, since you quoted me saying we have to control. Well, I'm thinking of CO2. That because the carbon stays in the system. One of the messages of my talk today, stays in the system, so the biosphere system so closely coupled and somewhat closed. We can't just wait for the biosphere to readjust our CO2 to prevent global warming going to an unhealthy, to put it mildly, level. So in that sense, but now we have a world system of nations that are in a way autonomous, learning to try to cooperate on some kind of global scale. So it is pushing the nations to think about coordinating to, whether we like it or not, to do something about atmospheric CO2 levels. I mean, by like it or not, by being like it or not, I don't mean this is a huge and difficult discussion, okay? And the question is deep. But on the other hand, many people say, in terms of setting aside parts of nature, E.O. Wilson's concept of letting half the world, half of nature be, that's saying we're not treating the biosphere as an anonymous system that we are going to control everything in terms of the preserves, but we have to let nature do its own thing, so to speak, to use a 60s term or 70s term. Do your thing, nature. We trust you to coordinate some of the stuff you need. We don't have to figure out every species of bacteria that's going to be in the soil, and we are not capable of doing that in any sort of time. So we have to rely on the wisdom, so to speak, of the autonomous Gaian autopoietic systems to help us. So there's some kind of dance between the anonymous and autonomous that I think we need to be thinking about. And that might be a nice theme to be more conscious about, the dance between the autonomous and anonymous. Any further thoughts on that, Amy? I would welcome them.
Well, it's an interesting metaphor used because it's the exact one that I'm working on the preface for this book, and it's the metaphor that Francisco uses in the 78, 79 book, which is that you need both perspectives, but you need to be aware of both of the perspectives. You need to be aware of where you're standing. It goes back a little bit to what Laura was talking about, is if you're within the system, how can you, you can't be within and without the system, but the difference, I guess, between us and many other beings is that we can be aware of where we are in terms of the system in relationship to the system and have a certain type of vigilance about our positioning.
Yeah. Yeah, I was very much hoping some of the conversation would go in this direction as well as the technical direction more. But I was really hoping, and it did, with the group here. Really
that
nice.
Might be where people's spirituality comes in, is in that vigilance.
Yeah, in the vigilance. Yes, I agree with that comment. That's would be where some of the spirituality would have to come in the vigilance. Yes. Fred, you want to say a word? You put a word in the text. Fred Steyer does a lot of work with systems.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not on video. No, I just wanted to emphasize what Amy was saying, that it's sort of a braiding, or, I'm not sure of the metapattern that would justify it, but allopoiesis and autopoiesis is very much what we've been talking about this whole time. So,
a braiding with another term, in addition to dance, vigilance, mutual contemplation of keeping them both in mind, not too rapidly jumping to one or the other, but in the sort of the transcending of what might seem like conflicting opposites, bringing them together and thinking of them, of the autonomous and autonomous together as some system that's going to require some new directions of thinking.
Yeah,
I like that very much. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. Thanks for those questions, Amy. And thank you also, Frederick, for beautiful words. And so I think we're just about out of time. So I think we're going to close here unless there's any final. Would you like to add anything else? Maybe Tyler, so you have the last. Yeah.
Bruno had a hand up, and Gabor, I think maybe if you.
Oh, I just wanted to indicate that Bruce is raising his hand.
Okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Why I've always loved Tyler's work on Gaia is he just gives it so much weight. I mean, it's a material, cosmological, material, cosmic totality. In other words, the complexity. What you get from Tyler is just a very disciplined way to understand the complexity and the various parts, the guilds. So, for instance, what I wanted to say about the crucial question that Amy brought up is that so there's all this imbrication. That was kind of the point I took, Tyler, about the surface area, which you didn't really dilate on, but the point is the surface area is where the ratios of transfer are possible, right? So that but the main point here is that we can still conceive of Gaia, that there is a final iteration, right? There's Gaia altogether. And that's usually the level we just try to think of it on, but that's unwieldy because it's too holistic in a way. You want to get it down to a level you can deal with. And so so we can't control Gaia. I'd say I'm willing to be definitive, but no, we cannot exert any kind of final control over the total operation of the Gaian system. But what we might possibly do is intervene at a guild level where our deliberate choices might make a difference. And that's obviously in the whole issue of CO2 mitigation. However, we might, work that out as an international polity. So, but I think that's not the entire solution, but we have to be working on that. So that's where that was all I really wanted to say, that the complexification of the image of Gaia's totality of operations is just such a more healthy way to try to use Gaia in the political arena. So that's it.
Well said, well summarized. And so once again, Tyler, thank you so much for this talk, which I think we're all walking away with a sense of the dance and the braiding and the imbrication of the scientific and the humanistic, as you were just pointing out, Bruno. And I think we've all really learned a lot and have a lot more to reflect on in the coming days and weeks. So thank you so much once again.
Yeah, you're welcome. I thank the Mind Life folks who were in on the early discussion with me about this, and today, Johanna and Derek and Gabor and Amy in particular is being there right from the start when we talked about what would go into this meeting late last spring, about the fall. So, yep. Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. So I think we'll make just a couple of announcements before we all head off. Got our end slide. Yep, there we go. So for anyone who's interested in joining us for 2 online programs next week, actually now we're in full swing of our online programming. Next Wednesday, we're actually kicking off the first session of semester 3 of Core in Action. So this might be of interest to a lot of you here in the room or following on YouTube. We'll be doing we'll be continuing our close reading of the Embodied Mind, the second half of the Embodied Mind this semester. And we'll have Dr. Sebastian Voros presenting on chapter 7. That's next Wednesday at 6 p.m. It'll also be live streamed on YouTube. And then we have an Emily Friends webinar with Dr. Hanna de Jager, who is an inactive philosopher, and she'll be specifically focusing on the imbrication of theory and practice from an inactive perspective in the caring profession. So that's next Thursday at 6 p.m. So feel free to join the public talk on Wednesday or join the Emily Friends subscription for Thursday. So thanks once again, everyone who showed up this evening, for all of your really, really great questions. And once again to Tyler, thanks a lot, and have a really good evening, or as it may be, rest of the afternoon.